Before dawn broke the silence, it's a little after 2 in the morning, and the Atlantic feels endless, dark, cold, and strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you pull your blanket a little closer, even though you're safe in bed. Out there, hundreds of survivors drift in small lifeboats, the sea rocking them just enough to remind them they're still alive. They don't know what time it is. They don't know who else survived. All they know is that the ship behind them, the one that was too grand, too modern, too confident to fail, is gone. And now, all they can do is wait for something, anything, to break the horizon. By 4 a.m., something finally does. Low lights appear in the distance, soft at first, then steady, then unmistakably real. The RMS Carpathia is approaching, steam pushed to its limit through the freezing night. For the survivors, this is the first sign that the ordeal might end. For the crew of the Carpathia, it's the beginning of hours of non-stop work as they prepare to take in more than 700 people from lifeboats, never meant to hold them so long. As the first boats draw near, the scene is quiet, almost subdued. Many inside can't speak. Some can't move. Hypothermia settles into hands and feet, freezing sensation away until even pain disappears. Others shake so hard the wooden boats tremble beneath them. The jump from lifeboat to rescue ladder looks simple in movies. In reality, it takes every remaining ounce of strength and often help from above and below to pull someone safely onto the deck. The Carpathia's doctors have been preparing since the distress call came through. Blankets, makeshift treatment areas, and whatever hot drinks the galley can manage fill the once orderly rooms. As survivors step aboard, some carried, some limping, some barely conscious, they're guided toward warmth and medical care. Frostbite is everywhere, fingers stiff and pale, toes that no longer respond, feet submerged too long in water, colder than a winter breath. Bruises and fractures tell the story of hurried escapes, collapsing decks and lifeboats lowered in chaos. Among those brought aboard is Harold Bride, a 22-year-old wireless operator whose night had been longer than anyone else's. He'd worked the ship's telegraph until water reached the cabin, tapping out messages that were as urgent as any the ocean had ever heard. He escaped on an overturned collapsible lifeboat, clinging to its edge while his feet remained half submerged in the freezing water. By the time the Carpathia's crew pulled him up, one foot was sprained, the other frostbitten and nearly blackened. But Bride, practical and stubborn in the most inconvenient way, insists he isn't done. As soon as he's patched up enough to sit upright, he joins the Carpathia's wireless operator to continue sending messages, updates, survivor lists, reassurances as the ship heads toward New York. His bandaged feet dangle above the floor, but he keeps working, tapping calmly through the hum of engines and the murmurs of rescued passengers. Around him, the ship settles into a rhythm. Crew members hand out blankets and guide confused passengers through narrow corridors. The dining rooms become temporary infirmaries. Survivors whisper names, searching for familiar faces. Some find them, many do not. Yet the atmosphere remains steady, almost gentle, as though the Carpathia has decided to wrap itself around the people it just saved and carry them the rest of the way home. By the time dawn touches the horizon, the rescue is well underway. Nearly every lifeboat has been accounted for. The sea is still cold, still quiet, but no longer empty, and the survivors now have a ship beneath their feet, a destination ahead and a fragile return to safety unfolding mile by mile. 1. The quiet hours before the questions began. On the Carpathia, the days following the rescue settle into a rhythm that feels almost weightless, soft footsteps in narrow corridors, muted conversations drifting like gentle waves, and the steady hum of engines pushing everyone toward New York. Amid this quiet movement, one cabin remains noticeably undisturbed. Inside is Bruce Ismay, chairman of the company that owned the Titanic, now wrapped in blankets and silence. Crew members slip in only to leave food or check on him. He doesn't say much. He doesn't have to. The weight of the night still sits heavily on his shoulders, and the ship's staff gives him room as though the air around him has thinned. The rest of the Carpathia is far livelier. Survivors trade fragments of memories where they were, who they saw, how the water looked under the stars. The stories overlap, contradict, and twist just slightly, with each telling, creating a drifting tapestry of recollection. Reporters, meanwhile, are hard at work far away on land, typing up whatever rumors reach their desks. Some newspapers claim Titanic is still afloat. Others announce that thousands have survived. A few, notably ambitious, even print imaginary interviews with passengers who very much have not yet set foot in New York. Information is flying faster than any ship can sail, and accuracy is mostly optional. This chaos reaches Washington long before the Carpathia does. Senator William Alden Smith, a man who moves with the determined calm of someone who enjoys a good procedural hearing, reads the first conflicting headlines and immediately decides something must be done. After all, when a ship described as unsinkable suddenly sinks, people tend to want answers. And when those answers arrive tangled in rumor and melodrama, someone has to sort them out. Smith calls for a formal Senate inquiry, one that will begin as soon as the survivors reach American soil. While preparations unfold on land, a curious detail emerges from the wireless exchanges. A pattern in the telegraph traffic hints that certain messages were being routed with unusual urgency, ones specifically concerning Bruce Ismay and a small group of crew members. These signals suggest an attempt to get them on a fast ship back to England before any hearings could begin. Whether this was a logistical decision, a protective measure, or simply wishful thinking, no one seems entirely sure. But the idea of key witnesses slipping away before they can testify certainly catches the attention of Senator Smith. Meanwhile, life on the Carpathia continues at its own gentle pace. Survivors rest, eat warm meals, and adjust to the strange in-between state of no longer being at sea, yet not quite being home. The crew stays attentive, making sure everyone has blankets, fresh clothing, or a quiet place to sit. Evenings feel calmer now, the earlier urgency replaced by a soft, drifting routine. People lean against railings to watch the horizon, trying not to think too much, just breathing, existing, letting the steady motion of the ship do the comforting. Then comes the morning of April 18th, 1912. After days of travel, the skyline of New York appears like a pale line through the mist. The closer the Carpathia gets, the clearer the view becomes, not just of the city, but of the crowds waiting along the piers. Police officers, reporters with notebooks ready, families holding photographs, and onlookers simply drawn by the gravity of the moment, all gather in numbers that ripple across the waterfront. The air is thick with expectation, curiosity, and the unmistakable hum of questions waiting to be asked. As the ship eases into the dock, a quiet soreness settles over the passengers. For survivors, the sight of land is grounding yet overwhelming. For the crew, it signals the transition from rescue to responsibility. And for Senator Smith, now standing near the gangway, with an expression somewhere between solemn and purposeful, it marks the start of an investigation that has been gathering momentum since the first unclear newspaper headline hit the stands. Smith boards with minimal ceremony, though the presence of reporters ensures every step is noticed. He carries with him the authority of the United States Senate and, more importantly, a stack of summonses. His first visit is to the cabin where Bruce Ismay remains. The knock is gentle, the atmosphere even gentler, but the message is clear. He and the surviving officers are formally required to appear before the Senate. The hearing will begin immediately while memories are fresh, and ideally, before any convenient, return trips to England take shape. Outside the ship, the rescue efforts shift into a new phase. Volunteers from relief organizations have set up stations stocked with clothing, blankets, and small comforts. Temporary lodging is arranged for those who have nowhere to go. Lists of survivors are posted and reposted, each update greeted with hope from waiting families. At a nearby warehouse, crates of donated garments arrive, some practical, some questionable, some clearly chosen by people who assumed that if you've survived a maritime disaster, you might also appreciate an oversized velvet coat from someone's attic. Still, the gesture is sincere, and the survivors accept what they need with quiet gratitude. Across the ocean, similar relief efforts unfold in England. Charities organize funds, communities gather supplies. Letters, telegrams, and offers of support move rapidly, each one a small thread in the larger fabric of reconstruction. Many passengers, especially those traveling in third class, had been immigrating permanently. With their plans suddenly torn apart, these support networks become vital, providing shelter, food, and the first steps toward rebuilding their disrupted journeys. Back in New York, the Carpathia begins to empty slowly, almost tenderly. Families reunite, reporters circle like soft-spoken moths, gathering details that will fill the next day's papers. Harbor workers guide passengers toward waiting carriages, trams, or temporary accommodations. Through it all, the steady rhythm of the city surrounds them. Warm, humming, indifferent, and surprisingly comforting. The survivors step into this rhythm, some limping, some supported by strangers, some walking alone. They carry no luggage, no keepsakes, only the memory of a night that changed the Atlantic. And trailing closely behind them, like a quiet companion, is the beginning of an inquiry that will soon unfold in full view of the public. Slow, methodical, and determined to understand exactly what happened and why. For now, though, the city just breathes around them. The questions can wait a little longer. The hearings will come soon enough. Tonight is simply the night they arrived, tired, bundled in borrowed coats, stepping into the soft lights of New York as the world holds its breath and prepares to listen. The soft murmur of testimony. In the days after the Carpathia docked, New York hummed quietly with anticipation. Not the loud, bustling kind, more like a low, steady vibration beneath the city's usual rhythm. People whispered names, repeated headlines, and passed along theories with the same confident calm as someone whispering a bedtime secret. And at the center of this growing curiosity stood an unexpected stage. A suite inside the Waldorf Astoria, transformed not into a ballroom or a grand hall, but into the temporary chamber of the United States Senate inquiry. Senator William Alden Smith, who had made it clear he preferred answers sooner rather than later, set the tone for what would unfold. And the first person called to speak was Bruce Ismay. Ismay arrived quietly, guided through back corridors, to avoid the clusters of reporters gathering outside. The public reception toward him had not softened. If anything, it had grown sharper with each passing headline, People questioned why he survived while so many did not. They examined photographs of the overcrowded docks, hoping to read guilt in the angle of his shoulders or the position of his hands. But inside the hearing room, everything slowed. Voices dropped. Chairs scraped softly against polished floors. The atmosphere carried the same gentle hush as a late-night documentary, steady, calm, designed to keep listeners from stirring too much. When Ismay took his seat, he spoke with a restrained clarity, each word carefully measured. He described the final moments aboard the Titanic as methodically as someone recounting instructions from a manual. The ship was sinking. Passengers were being loaded into lifeboats. He assisted where he could, and when no other women or children were present near his side of the deck, he stepped into a boat. That was the sequence, he explained. Neither dramatic nor heroic, just procedural. Senators pressed him gently about speed. Rumors had circulated that he encouraged Captain Smith to push the engines harder, chasing a record-crossing time. Ismay denied it, calmly and consistently. No, he said, he gave no orders and made no suggestions about speed. The Titanic's pace had been decided by the officers, not by him. But outside the inquiry room, metaphorically and sometimes literally, float fragments of testimony from various passengers, each one shaped slightly differently. Some recall conversations on deck about making good time. Some repeat comments allegedly heard during dinner. A few insist speed was indeed a topic Ismay cared deeply about. The stories don't align neatly, and the mismatch becomes a quiet background hum beneath the senator's questions, like static on a radio that no one can quite tune out. If Ismay's testimony is crisp and controlled, the next major witness brings something entirely different to the room. The steady, seasoned composure of Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking surviving officer from the Titanic. Lightoller arrives with the posture of someone who has spent most of his life at sea, straight-backed, calmly balanced, and remarkably unshaken by the setting. When he begins speaking, the hearing shifts into a smoother, almost rhythmic flow. His voice has a matter-of-fact softness to it, the kind that makes even technical details feel strangely soothing. He explains the lifeboat loading system. Women and children first, a phrase he repeats with such consistency that it settles into the room like a lullaby. If lullabies involved maritime protocols and weight distribution considerations. According to him, the principle guided every decision made at the davits. As a result, several lifeboats left the ship partially filled, not because of panic, but because they followed the rule strictly and precisely. The senators listen, eyebrows lifting slightly, at the realization that order, not chaos, had contributed to the underfilled boats. Lightoller also describes the structure of the ship, its watertight compartments, its deck arrangements, and the assumptions officers held about its buoyancy. He explains how water spread more quickly than expected, how internal doors closed, how the tilt of the ship shifted subtly from one moment to the next. These details roll through the room with an unexpected serenity, as though he's describing the mechanics of a quiet machine rather than a disaster. Then comes the question everyone has been waiting for, delivered in a tone far gentler than the newspapers would have preferred. Did the ship break in two? Lightoller doesn't hesitate. No, he says, absolutely not. In his recollection, the ship sank intact, slipping beneath the water in one piece. His certainty is unwavering, smooth as glass. And although later evidence will tell a different story, the men sitting before him accept his answer with nods that ripple through the room like a soft breeze. As the session continues, senators guide him through each stage of the sinking. He recounts his reasoning at various points, decisions made based on information available in the moment, judgments formed quickly in the dark. If any errors occurred, he frames them as natural consequences of limited knowledge, not negligence. The tone of the hearing matches his calmness. Even tense moments drift by with a slow, measured grace. Outside the Waldorf Astoria, however, the city is less serene. Reporters wait eagerly, hoping for contradictions, confessions, or at least a quote dramatic enough to justify the price of ink. But inside the hearing room, everything remains strangely tranquil. Witnesses come and go with a soft shuffle. Papers are passed across tables with barely a whisper. Questions rise and fall like gentle tides. By the end of this phase of the inquiry, the senators hold a collection of testimonies, some aligned, some clashing, some shaped by memory, duty, or public pressure. Ismay insists on technical restraint and denies influencing speed. Passengers recall their own interpretations. Lightoller speaks with unwavering precision about procedures, structure, and the sequence of events, never straying from his steady account. And through it all, the hearings unfold like a slow, quiet unraveling of a night already etched into history. No raised voices, no theatrical flourishes, just the soft murmur of questions, the steady cadence of answers, and the gentle weight of truth, still shifting, still incomplete, settling into place piece by subtle piece. Ships in the quiet distance. The hearings continued with a gentle persistence, moving from one thread of the story to another, like someone slowly untangling a long piece of yarn in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. After the testimonies of Ismay and Lightoller, the focus drifted outward, toward the surrounding sea on that April night, and toward other ships whose roles had become quiet points of curiosity. One name rose again and again, drifting through the inquiry rooms like a calm but insistent whisper: the SS Californian. The Californian had been the closest ship to the Titanic that night, positioned in waters just distant enough to feel safe, but close enough that, according to some accounts, her crew might have seen distress rockets rising into the sky. These rockets became the soft, glowing heart of the controversy, silent arcs of light cutting through the dark, asking for help from anyone who happened to be watching the horizon. Captain Stanley Lord, commander of the Californian, entered the hearings with a posture that suggested he was both composed and slightly bewildered to find himself in the national spotlight. He answered questions politely, maintaining the tone of someone explaining a misunderstanding that had gone just a bit too far. According to him, no distress signals were recognized that night. His ship had stopped because of nearby ice. The wireless operator had gone off duty, and nothing about the faint lights on the horizon had seemed alarming enough to wake the crew. His testimony held steady, soft, and simple. No, he had not understood the rockets as signals of distress. Yes, the ship was stopped for safety. No, he had not ignored a catastrophe unfolding nearby. But testimony from other sources trickled in with a slightly sharper edge. Crew members from the Titanic reported firing multiple rockets. Some witnesses believed that the Californian had been visible. Others insisted it had even been close enough that help might have reached them in time. None of this formed a clear picture, but the uncertainty only deepened the interest. The senator's questions remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness beneath them, something like the soft click of a metronome keeping time. The eventual conclusion was also presented gently. While the Californian might not have knowingly ignored a distress call, its response was undeniably slow. And in the margins of that delay, many lives slipped into the sea. The inquiry did not accuse Captain Lord of malice, It simply acknowledged that the ship could have done more earlier with a little more vigilance. In the world of maritime history, that small could have would linger for decades. As Captain Lord stepped away from the hearings, another thread of the inquiry drifted into focus, one that carried just a touch of social intrigue, the kind that newspapers adored: the Duff Gordon incident. Lifeboat number 1 had launched with only a handful of people aboard, despite having room for many more. Among its occupants were Sir Cosmo and Lady Lucille Duff Gordon, whose presence alone added a delicate shimmer of notoriety. What turned the incident into a hearing room discussion, though, was the matter of money. After reaching safety, Sir Cosmo had given each of the lifeboat's crew members a modest sum of cash, officially as compensation for lost belongings, though some claimed it resembled an attempted bribe to avoid returning for additional survivors. The senators approached the topic with a gentle politeness, as though discussing a slightly awkward dinner party misunderstanding. Sir Cosmo explained calmly that the money had carried no ulterior motive. It was meant as a gesture, not a command. The crew members agreed, yet the public, already simmering with frustration toward the wealthy, found the situation harder to swallow. To them, a lifeboat leaving half empty during a disaster seemed negligent. Adding a small envelope of cash afterward felt suspicious, no matter how politely it was described. This tension seeped into the hearings in soft but noticeable ways, blending into a broader question of responsibility. As more witnesses spoke, crew members, passengers, maritime experts, the senators collected recurring themes like seashells in the tide. The Titanic had been traveling fast. There had not been enough lifeboats for everyone. Many of the boats that did exist had left the ship partially filled. Crew members were not thoroughly trained for evacuation on a ship of that scale, and communication between vessels in icy waters had been inconsistent at best. None of these observations were delivered with anger. The inquiry was not designed to shout. Instead, the findings drifted into place with a slow, gentle clarity, the kind that settles in only after hours of careful listening. Blame, however, is much louder outside a courtroom. Public opinion swelled like a tide. Some pointed at Captain Smith for the ship's speed, others at Bruce Ismay for influencing decisions, others at the officers for the loading of lifeboats, and still others at Captain Lord of the Californian for staying still when the night sky flashed with silent distress. Even the shipbuilder and the White Star Line found themselves under heavy scrutiny, their choices threaded quietly into every newspaper column. By the time the American hearings neared their conclusion, the senators laid out their findings in the same steady tone used throughout the inquiry. The report did not seek dramatic revelations. Instead, it assembled a clear list of shortcomings, presented with the softness of someone laying down cards, one by one. The Titanic had been traveling at excessive speed in a region known for ice. There were not enough lifeboats to accommodate all aboard. Crew training regarding evacuation procedures had been insufficient. The Californian had failed to respond promptly to distress rockets. Communication practices across the industry needed reevaluation. These findings formed the foundation for future maritime reforms, but inside the Waldorf Astoria, they simply marked the close of a chapter in the inquiry. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic conclusions, just a soft folding of papers, a gentle clearing of voices, and the sense that the story was still expanding, still gathering details like distant ripples moving slowly toward shore. The hearings would continue in England and debates would unfold across oceans. But for now, the American inquiry had settled into a calm, steady end. The senators stepped back, the witnesses dispersed, and the quiet hum of the city resumed, carrying with it the lingering echoes of ships in the night, one sinking, one silent, and all of them now woven into a narrative the world would keep unraveling for years to come. Listening to a sinking in slow motion. When the American hearings wound gently to a close, the story did not settle. Across the Atlantic, the British government leaned forward with a quiet, unmistakable interest. Officials had read the American transcripts, flipped through the summaries, examined the conclusions, and responded with the kind of polite dissatisfaction the British are famous for. In short, they wanted their own investigation, their own witnesses, their own long stretch of meticulously phrased questions. And so another inquiry began, drifting into motion with the steady calm of a ship moving out of harbor under a pale gray sky. Presiding over this new chapter was Lord Mersey, a man whose experience in maritime matters ran deep, and whose connections in the shipping world seemed to form an invisible map around him. He carried himself with the relaxed certainty of someone who had seen nearly every type of nautical mishap pass through a courtroom at one time or another. If the American hearings felt like a lantern glowing quietly in the night, the British inquiry felt more like a gas lamp turned just slightly higher, warm and steady, but still polite enough not to disturb anyone's sleep. The location chosen for the inquiry had one charming flaw. The sound drifted strangely through the room. Words dissolved into soft echoes, disappearing before they reached the back rows. Observers leaned forward, straining delicately, as if listening to a faraway gramophone. This unintended acoustic haze softened even the most technical statements, wrapping the proceedings in a gentle layer of auditory fog. The first witnesses called were not officers or executives, but the men who had worked deep inside the ship, the engineers and the stokers. They stepped forward with the sturdy, unpolished confidence that comes from spending long hours beside engines and boilers. Their voices carried the understated authority of people who had watched the flooding begin from the inside, who had felt the cold Atlantic seep into steel corridors, well before anyone on deck understood the scale of the damage. These witnesses described the water entering the ship with calm precision, noting which compartments filled first, how quickly certain bulkheads were overtaken, and when the pumps became overwhelmed. Their testimony did not involve speculation, only observations, simple and steady, delivered like instructions read from a manual that had been memorized through routine. Each detail added texture to the investigator's understanding, showing how the flooding advanced through the belly of the ship with quiet inevitability. To help visualize these accounts, the inquiry introduced a large model of the Titanic, detailed enough that witnesses could point to specific areas, tracing the imagined path of incoming water. The model became a character in the room, placed on a table like a centerpiece at a very technical dinner party. It was pushed forward and backward, rotated gently and tapped lightly by witnesses who gestured to it with the same affectionate seriousness usually reserved for a house cat that refuses to move from the windowsill. As the witnesses spoke, Lord Mersey leaned in with interest, occasionally adjusting his posture to catch the softer statements lost to the poor acoustics. The testimony gave shape to something that had previously existed only in fragments: the exact way the ship's internal design affected its ability to withstand damage. When Charles Littler was called once more, the atmosphere settled into the familiar softness of a recurring scene. His voice, steady and deliberate, drifted through the inquiry room like the slow turning of a compass needle. He walked the investigators through the technical elements of the ship, describing watertight doors, bulkhead layouts, and the subtle ways in which water could slide from one compartment to the next without immediately revealing itself on deck. The inquiry soon confirmed that identifying the ship's true condition during the sinking had been far more difficult than anyone on land might imagine. The Titanic was vast, and its internal structure produced a kind of deceptive calm. Water could surge quietly behind steel walls without producing dramatic noises or visible signs. Officers on deck relied on incomplete reports, and the angle of the ship shifted with such gradual subtlety that the early stages of the sinking felt almost gentle, giving many aboard a false sense of time. One particularly interesting line of questioning involved the gangway doors, located near the waterline. These large doors could, in theory, allow passengers to step directly from the ship into rescue boats. They were designed for dockside use, not emergencies. But some questioned whether opening them that night might have enabled more people to evacuate. Engineers and officers explained with calm technical certainty why the gangway doors were not opened. First, many of them were already unreachable by the time evacuation procedures were underway. Water had risen quickly along certain sections, blocking corridors and drowning access points. Second, opening a gangway door too early could accelerate flooding dramatically, allowing water to enter a compartment in a broad, unmanageable rush. And finally, even if the doors had been opened safely, there was no guarantee that rescue boats were near enough or positioned securely enough to load passengers without risk. In the inquiry room, these explanations unfolded slowly, like pages turning in a thick technical manual. Nothing was rushed, nothing was embellished. The senators and experts absorbed each detail, creating a picture that, while complex, felt increasingly coherent. Witnesses continued describing technical procedures, communication challenges, and the delicate balance officers had tried to maintain between preventing panic and conveying urgency. Lightoler's testimony remained unwavering, his interpretations consistent with what he had said in the American inquiry. When asked again whether the ship had broken in two, he maintained the same steady answer: number. From where he had been positioned, he had seen no such break. The British inquiry took its time, lingering on each technical point with the soft, unhurried patience of someone diffusing a large knot of threads. Lord Mersey listened, asked precise questions, and let the narrative grow steadily more detailed. If the American hearings resembled a broad, sweeping outline, the British proceedings felt like a careful sketch, shaded slowly with fine strokes. Even the acoustics, troublesome as they were, contributed subtly to the atmosphere. Words floated through the space like mist, encouraging everyone to lean in and listen more closely. The softness of the sound seemed to match the style of the testimony itself, calm voices describing mechanical processes, structural limitations, and the shifting logic of decisions made in real time. Trained seamen explained the challenges of launching lifeboats in the dark, relying on deck angles, hull curvature, and changing water lines. Engineers traced the hidden routes water had taken deep within the ship. Officers spoke about communication barriers, darkness, and the complexity of assessing the integrity of a vessel the size of a floating city. Every detail added another layer to the gently expanding story, each piece fitting into the larger puzzle without raising the emotional temperature of the room. The inquiry gradually built a clear and comprehensive understanding of why the Titanic sank the way it did, and why so many decisions that later seemed questionable had, in the moment, been shaped by limited information and structural constraints. It became clear that misjudgments were often rooted not in negligence, but in the complicated design of the ship and the natural human desire to avoid causing unnecessary alarm in a situation that initially appeared manageable. By the time this portion of the British inquiry drew to a close, the atmosphere felt almost meditative. Witnesses had come forward one by one, offering glimpses into metal corridors, machinery rooms, and dimly lit decks. The large model of the Titanic rested quietly on its table, now marked by the touch of many hands. The room, despite its flawed acoustics, had held hours of slow, technical storytelling, shaping a narrative that moved with the gentle steadiness of waves against a hull. Nothing in these hearings felt rushed or dramatic. Instead, the proceedings flowed with the smooth, calming rhythm of a ship gliding through calm water. And in this softness, in this patient unfolding of detail, the British inquiry found its voice, creating a version of the story grounded not only in memory, but in structure, design, and the subtle mechanics of a night that had grown more complex with every retelling. The gentle unraveling of responsibility. As the British inquiry drifted into its later stages, the atmosphere softened further, settling into a rhythm that felt almost like quiet pages turning in a long bedside book. Testimonies had been gathered, models examined, and technical details reviewed with a kind of patient curiosity that suited the sleep-like tone of the proceedings. Now came the phase where everything would be shaped into conclusions, not sharp or accusing, but arranged with the calm steadiness of someone sorting seashells along the edge of the tide. One of the recurring threads that resurfaced was Charles Lightoller and his unwavering conviction about the final moments of the Titanic. Throughout both the American and British inquiries, he maintained that the ship had not broken in two. He repeated this with the ease of a sailor stating cardinal directions, calm and absolute. No matter how many other witnesses hinted otherwise or how many questions nudged gently at the possibility, his position remained stable. The ship went down intact. His certainty drifted through the room like a quiet anchor, even though history would eventually place that anchor elsewhere. Another familiar face returned for additional questioning, Bruce Ismay. His second round of testimony in the British inquiry felt noticeably softer. The questioning lacked the sharper edges he had encountered in New York. Here, the tone was closer to a polite afternoon conversation, lightly structured, almost soothing in its cadence. The questions drifted toward clarifications more than confrontations, and Ismay answered with a subdued steadiness, adding small details to points already explored. Yet beneath the gentle pacing of the hearing lay a quieter absence, one that many observers would later point out. No third-class passengers were called to testify. Considering the very high loss of life in that group, their absence settled into the record like a blank page. Whether this omission resulted from oversight, convenience, or an assumption about whose voices were considered relevant, it added a subtle imbalance to the inquiry. It was not spoken aloud, but it hovered there. A small silence within the larger conversation. As the inquiry drew toward its conclusions, the report began taking shape in a tone that matched the rest of the proceedings, calm, composed, lightly structured. Instead of dramatic accusations, it presented measured findings, each one placed carefully like small stones arranged along a garden path. The first major conclusion centered on speed. The Titanic had been traveling too quickly for conditions in an icy region. The language of the report was polite, almost gentle, but firm enough to underline the point. Sailing fast through waters known for drifting ice was not ideal, and this choice contributed to the ship's vulnerability. Next came the issue of lifeboats. The inquiry confirmed what had already become widely understood. The ship simply did not carry enough for everyone on board. Even though it met the existing regulations at the time, those regulations were themselves outdated, and the inquiry acknowledged that a vessel carrying thousands of people required far more capacity. The phrasing avoided alarm or condemnation, but the meaning was clear. Provisions had been insufficient. The training of the crew followed as another point of assessment. Testimony had revealed that many members of the crew had not been thoroughly instructed on emergency procedures for a ship of that scale. The report noted that this contributed to slower decision-making, inconsistent actions, and misunderstandings during the evacuation. Again, the language avoided intensity, settling instead into an understated recommendation for better training in the future. The inquiry also addressed the actions of the Californian. While it did not accuse Captain Stanley Lord of intentional negligence, it concluded that his ship had not responded adequately to the situation. The rockets observed in the sky should have prompted more decisive action. The Californian could have approached sooner, could have attempted communication, or could have kept its wireless operator on duty longer. The phrasing remained mild, almost soothing, but the conclusion lingered with unmistakable weight. The response had been insufficient. One notable aspect of the final report was its treatment of Captain Edward Smith. No personal blame was assigned to him. His decisions were framed within the broader context of maritime norms of the time, standard practices, existing regulations, and widely held assumptions about the ship's seaworthiness. The tone suggested respect for a long career and acknowledged that decisions made in darkness and uncertainty cannot be judged solely through the clarity that hindsight generously provides. Structural questions about the ship itself also appeared in the inquiry's conclusions. Many wondered whether the design of the Titanic, including the layout of decks and compartments, affected third-class passengers disproportionately during the evacuation. The report did not endorse this idea. It stated that the structure did not intentionally hinder escape for any class and did not accept the claim that passengers in lower classes were physically prevented from reaching lifeboats due to design limitations. The inquiry attributed the discrepancies in survival rates to other factors, primarily location within the ship, language barriers, and limited early communication. All these conclusions together formed a portrait that was neither harsh nor forgiving, but quietly balanced. The tone was steady, almost meditative. It acknowledged flaws, avoided personal vilification, and focused instead on systemic issues that required correction. In a sense, the conclusions resembled the inquiries themselves, gentle on the surface, meticulous underneath, and guided by the goal of preventing future tragedies, rather than assigning emotional blame. As the report circulated, it became clear that the British inquiry had produced a distinctly different document from the American one. Where the American hearings had felt urgent, fueled by conflicting news and immediate public pressure, the British process felt more like a long exhale, slow, deliberate, and layered. Observers noted the polite phrasing of the conclusions, the absence of certain witnesses, and the softness of the tone even when addressing clear shortcomings. Many found comfort in the thoroughness. Others found gaps. But regardless of opinion, the report settled into the historical record with the quiet assurance of something officially signed, neatly bound, and placed onto a shelf where it would be referenced for generations. In the end, the British inquiry left behind a narrative shaped by calm voices, steady testimonies, and technical explanations delivered with understated certainty. Lightollers' unwavering denial, Ismay's softened responses, the missing voices of third-class passengers, the lightly worded critiques of speed, lifeboat numbers, crew training, and the Californians' actions, all of these threads wove into a final document that moved as gently as the tides that once carried the great ship herself. No single person was cast as a villain. No accusation rang loudly. Instead, the responsibility unfolded in broad strokes, quietly shared across decisions, assumptions, and long-standing maritime practices. And as the inquiry concluded, its findings drifted outward into public understanding, becoming part of the tapestry of the Titanic's legacy, soft in tone yet lasting in influence, a calm echo in the long story of a ship that had captured the world's attention with both its grandeur and its loss. The long, quiet journey through the courts. When the inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic finally folded into their shelves, another chapter began to unfold, one far less dramatic on the surface, yet stretching out in time like a slow, winding river. Legal matters have a way of moving gently, deliberately, almost sleepily, and the Titanic litigation proved no exception. It drifted forward, not with the roar of engines, but with the soft rustle of paperwork, the careful shuffle of attorneys, and the low murmur of courtroom air that always seems a few degrees cooler than the outside world. In 1912, only months after the sinking, the White Star Line made its first significant legal move. Drawing upon the United States Limitation of Liability Act of 1851, a law old enough to feel like it belonged in a dusty maritime storybook, the company requested what the act allowed, a strict limitation on how much it had to pay. According to the law, owners of a vessel could limit their financial liability to the value of the ship's remains and any pending freight, provided they had no knowledge of negligence. Since the Titanic now rested on the ocean floor and carried no surviving cargo of value, the total amount White Star could be required to pay came to roughly $91,000. Yes, $91,000 for an event that shook the world. Even in 1912 dollars, the figure seemed almost miniature, like a single pebble placed beside a mountain. But legally speaking, it was a legitimate request, and the company filed it with the composed confidence of those accustomed to navigating maritime statutes as effortlessly as normal people navigate grocery aisles. Naturally, this limitation meant that anyone wishing to file a claim had to step forward quickly. The court set a deadline, April 15th, 1913, exactly 1 year after the sinking. This gave families, survivors, and businesses time to gather their papers, memories, bills, and itemized lists of lost belongings, all of which began flowing into the legal system like slow-moving tides. By the time the deadline arrived, the total amount requested in claims had exceeded $16 million. The contrast between the claims and the $91,000 limitation created a quiet tension, not the dramatic clash you see in films, but a soft, insistent pressure, like 2 pages of a book trying to lie flat against one another, but refusing to sit smoothly. The claims themselves formed a catalog of human loss, though described in the gentle, neutral language of legal filings. They included compensation for personal belongings, that had vanished into the Atlantic, from wardrobes to jewelry to musical instruments to bundles of letters. They listed injuries, both physical and lingering. They described psychological harm, medical costs, and the abrupt disappearance of family breadwinners. Many claims were simple and practical. Others were detailed enough to read like inventory sheets for entire lives. A few stood out for their specificity or scale, catching the attention of court clerks who sorted them into stacks. Some families sought compensation for the loss of relatives who had provided steady income. Others requested reimbursement for valuable items such as furs, silverware, travel trunks, and professionally tailored clothing. Musicians' families documented the value of instruments lost at sea. Travelers listed the contents of steamer trunks that held their essential belongings for new lives abroad. Each claim became a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of what the Titanic carried beyond passengers, hopes, responsibilities, and the practical foundations of everyday life. Negotiations began slowly, almost hesitantly, in part because maritime law is designed to move with care and precision, and in part because White Star Line was still recovering from the financial and reputational shock of losing its prized ship. The back-and-forth discussions stretched from 1912 into 1913, then into 1914, and then, somewhat inevitably, into 1915. Progress inched forward, accompanied by the steady hum of clerks typing, attorneys sorting documents, and judges reviewing arguments presented in tones so quiet they could lull an insomniac into a rare nap. One reason for the slow pace was the complexity of sorting so many claims under such an old law. Decisions had to be made about which losses qualified, which amounts were reasonable, and which claims could be grouped together. Another reason was the sheer scale of the tragedy. When hundreds of families are involved, the legal system shifts into its long form, stretching gently across months and years until all threads have been acknowledged, labeled, and carefully placed. Finally, in December 1915, the long negotiations reached their calm resolution. White Star agreed to a settlement of $664,000. This was more than 7 times the amount allowed under the original limitation, yet still amounted to roughly 4% of the total claimed. It was a compromise, quiet and unadorned, without celebration or dramatic statements. Just signatures on paper, followed by the soft clicking of pens being capped, and the slow exhale of a process that had lasted more than 3 years. The settlement was divided among claimants according to formulas devised by the court, which weighed factors such as financial dependency, documented property loss, and the specific circumstances of each claim. Some received modest sums. Others received amounts that covered only a fraction of their losses. Yet most accepted the settlement simply because the alternative was to continue waiting, perhaps for years more, in a process that had already stretched longer than the voyage itself ever had a chance to. In 1916, the legal story reached its final note when the court formally ruled that White Star Line had no prior knowledge of negligence that could have contributed to the sinking. According to the ruling, the company did not know and could not reasonably have been expected to know of any actions or decisions that constituted fault. This meant they could not be held personally liable for the disaster under the legal standards of the time. The decision drifted into the public record with a soft finality, like the gentle closing of a book. What remained afterward was not outrage or fanfare, but a quiet sense of completion. The legal battles had taken their course, moving steadily through the machinery of maritime law. Families had received their compensation, limited though it was. The company had fulfilled its obligations under the settlement. The courts had made their determinations, and the vast tragedy of the Titanic had shifted into the next phase of its history, one defined not by questions of blame, but by lessons, reforms, and the slow, steady reflection that had begun shaping the world's understanding. Through it all, the tone of the legal proceedings stayed oddly calm, almost soothing, despite the weight of the subject. Perhaps it was the nature of maritime law, with its centuries of procedure and ritual. Perhaps it was the somber respect people carried for the scale of the tragedy. Or perhaps it was simply that time itself had already begun to smooth the sharpest edges of grief into something gentler, something that could be spoken of in courtrooms without trembling in the voice. Looking back, the legal chapter of the Titanic story feels like a long, slow journey across still water. Not dramatic, not flashy, but patient, deliberate, and tinged with the quiet weight of lives rearranged by loss. It moved forward one document at a time, one claim at a time, one carefully worded conclusion at a time, until finally, in the soft close of 1916, the last page was placed gently atop the stack, and the court stepped back from the story. What the world did next would become another story entirely, shaped by memory, curiosity, innovation, and the evolving understanding of how a ship so celebrated could vanish into the sea, leaving behind not just sorrow, but a legacy that would travel steadily into history like a lantern floating across dark water. When the sea became a memory that kept moving. When the last hearings had settled into their quiet place in the public record, and when the early waves of newspaper questions finally drifted into calmer waters, life began its long process of rearranging itself around the people who had survived the Titanic. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in the slow, steady way that ordinary days have of reappearing after extraordinary ones. For the crew members, officers, musicians, and passengers, the world did not pause. Instead, it continued with its usual habit of presenting bills, work schedules, and responsibilities, each one arriving with the same clockwork rhythm as before. For the crew of the Titanic, the transition back to ordinary life happened more quickly than many might imagine. Their wages ended the moment the ship sank. Maritime employment in that era was often structured such that pay stopped when a voyage stopped, regardless of the circumstances. Since the voyage ended abruptly on the Atlantic floor, so did the income. The result was a quiet, practical shift, a sudden need to find work again, not out of preference, but necessity. Many applied immediately for new positions, scanning notices, contacting companies, and returning to the familiarity of ship service with the straightforwardness of people accustomed to seasonal employment. Several of them found themselves returning to sea sooner than any observer might expect, and some boarded none other than the Titanic's near-identical sister ship, the Olympic. The Olympic, still very much afloat and operational, continued to sail, bringing with it a curious mix of comfort and déjà vu for the crew members who had once walked its twins' corridors. The similarities between the two vessels were profound enough that stepping aboard the Olympic could feel like revisiting an old workplace that still existed, even though the original had vanished beneath miles of water. Yet for maritime workers, the logic was simple. Ships sailed, people needed income, and routines resumed. A more unusual situation arose with the families of the musicians who had played aboard the Titanic. These musicians had not been official crew members. They were contracted through an agency. After the sinking, families requested support, compensation, or at least the return of owed wages. Instead, they received a bill for the cost of the musicians' lost uniforms. The charge was issued with clerical precision, a perfect example of how administrative systems can sometimes operate independently of context. To the families, this became a surprisingly sharp piece of paperwork, though narrated in the quiet tone of an invoice rather than an emotional statement. Eventually, after much public attention, the matter settled, but the initial gesture lingered as one of those odd, memorable footnotes in maritime employment history. For the Titanic's officers, the aftermath formed a more varied landscape. Their positions before the sinking had been clearly defined, each with ranking, duties, and a structured path of advancement. After the event, that structure remained intact, yet the paths ahead diverged. Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking surviving officer, continued his maritime career with a measured steadiness. After participating in inquiries in both the United States and Britain, he returned to sea service. His experience and seniority allowed him to resume work with relative continuity. Lightoller's professional life eventually extended far beyond ordinary voyages. During the First World War, he served in various capacities, applying his maritime knowledge to wartime operations. Years later, he became known for assisting in the Dunkirk evacuation by sailing his private vessel across the English Channel as part of the civilian fleet that helped transport soldiers. His actions were organized with calm practicality, continuing a pattern of responding to maritime situations with procedural precision. Herbert Pittman, another surviving officer, followed a quieter professional path. After the inquiries, he returned to service for a period, maintaining his navigational duties in a consistent and dependable manner. Eventually, he shifted away from sea life and settled into work on land, where his maritime background contributed to the logistical nature of his later occupations. He maintained a simple preference for routine, avoiding public discussions about the Titanic except when formally required. Joseph Boxhall, who had been responsible for navigation and chart work aboard the Titanic, continued in maritime roles as well. His skills translated fluidly into ongoing employment within the White Star Line and later within its successor company. He participated in wartime navigation, applied his technical expertise to convoy coordination, and later served in civilian maritime planning. His trajectory formed a steady professional arc, shaped by competence, long experience, and a quiet preference for carrying out detailed tasks. Harold Lowe, known for his work launching lifeboats during the evacuation, also returned to sea service. He fulfilled officer duties aboard several vessels and eventually retired with a long service record that reflected years of disciplined, routine maritime work. Lowe rarely offered public commentary about the sinking. Instead, he focused on the practical aspects of his career, supervising crews, maintaining navigational discipline, and completing voyages as scheduled. As officers and crew members returned to maritime work, passengers moved forward in their own ways. The effects of the sinking, while not described through emotion, manifested in patterns observable in behavior, decision-making, and long-term activity. Some survivors reported recurring thoughts about maritime travel, leading them to avoid sea voyages or to choose specific types of travel arrangements afterward. Others displayed interruptions in rest patterns, particularly during long journeys or in environments that contained rhythmic sounds, reminiscent of engines or water movement. Certain individuals adopted behaviors focused on preparedness, such as maintaining awareness of exits in public places or paying close attention to transportation protocols. These actions did not possess emotional descriptions but reflected the long-term persistence of memory in shaping habitual responses. In modern terminology, these would be recognized as psychological effects, though at the time they were usually described simply as tendencies or habits that emerged after the event. For many survivors, life resumed in ways that appeared externally ordinary. They returned to households, occupations, and schedules that existed before the voyage. Employment resumed, children grew, and years passed in consistent cycles. In public, some spoke occasionally about their experiences when asked, usually offering clear, factual summaries rather than reflective commentary. They treated the event as something that had occurred, been recorded, and belonged to the realm of past travel, not present identity. Others chose a different approach, maintaining long-term silence about the sinking. They did not grant interviews, did not write accounts, and did not offer detailed recollections even among acquaintances. Their avoidance of conversation appeared not dramatic, but simply patterned, a quiet boundary around a topic they excluded from ordinary discussion. In their personal lives, this approach likely shaped social interactions only minimally as they continued participating in work, family responsibilities, and community activities without drawing attention to the subject. The long-term industry-wide effects of the sinking moved forward in parallel with the personal trajectories of survivors. Maritime organizations implemented new safety protocols, updated equipment standards, restructured communication systems, and introduced training that reflected lessons learned from the disaster. Although these regulatory changes formed part of the broader historical narrative rather than the individual stories of survivors, the two threads remained connected in their shared origin. For instance, the requirement that ships carry sufficient lifeboats for everyone aboard, regardless of tonnage, marked a significant departure from earlier regulations. Similarly, crew training programs expanded to include regular standardized boat drills. Ship design adjustments followed, with changes in watertight compartment arrangements, improved pumping systems, and more rigorous stability testing. International cooperation increased, especially in monitoring ice conditions and maintaining wireless communication schedules. Each of these developments occurred quietly through committees, conferences, and technical revisions, forming a backdrop of change that gradually reshaped the maritime world. Survivors often lived through these changes without participating directly in them, yet their experiences had contributed to the conditions that made the reforms necessary. Among passengers, the diversity of responses continued to appear over time. Some became involved in community organizations, public talks, or maritime education efforts, presenting factual accounts designed to inform rather than evoke reaction. Others preferred occupations unrelated to travel or transport and maintained stable careers in completely different fields. A number returned to their home countries or continued migrating as originally planned, integrating the voyage into their timeline without allowing it to disrupt long-term goals. Family histories evolved in similar ways. Relatives of survivors often heard fragments of the event but not complete narratives. In many households, references to the Titanic existed only in the form of practical details such as changes in travel decisions, preserved documents, or occasional factual remarks. In others, the event became a small, quiet part of family identity, mentioned sparingly but held with recognition of its historical significance. In time, the survivors aged, retired, moved through later stages of life, and eventually passed away, each leaving behind a set of patterns, choices, and effects that reflected both the event and the world's response to it. Their lives formed a mosaic of outcomes, some straightforward, some shaped subtly by their experience, all eventually absorbed into broader historical understanding. The long-term impact of the Titanic on individual survivors did not present itself in sharp emotional colors, but in gentle patterns of behavior, professional decisions, and shifting habits. The long-term impact on maritime regulation, by contrast, manifested in structural changes that would influence the industry for generations. Together, these two categories of aftermath continued moving in parallel, like two lines extending quietly from the same point on a chart, each growing at its own pace, yet always linked to the same origin. In this way, the story of the Titanic did not end with the inquiries or the legal settlements. It continued in the steady resumption of work by sailors and officers, in the professional paths shaped by maritime experience, in the patterns of thought and behavior that arose among survivors, in the industries that rewrote their rules, and in the small, quiet choices individuals made as they moved through the years that followed. The sea became a memory, not loud, not sharp, but persistent, shaping lives and systems in ways that unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, like gentle waves adjusting the shoreline one quiet evening at a time. When the sea learned to listen more closely. After the inquiries folded quietly into the archives and the legal disputes settled into their long resting places, the world of maritime travel found itself entering a gentle yet determined period of transformation. Not abrupt, not loud, but steady, like a tide that keeps returning a little farther up the shore each time. The sinking of the Titanic had shown the world where its assumptions were too soft, where its rules were too old, and where its confidence had outpaced its preparation. And so the industry began adjusting itself, one rule, one meeting, and one redesigned ship at a time. These adjustments did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, drifting through committees and conferences, whispered across drafting tables, carried in the notes of naval architects, and eventually written into international agreements that would reshape the way ships moved across the oceans. One of the earliest and most important changes arrived in the form of the Radio Act of 1912. Before the Titanic, wireless operators on ships worked regular shifts, often leaving their equipment unattended at night. The technology was still young, still treated more like a convenience than a lifeline. But after the disaster, the world understood that communication could no longer be considered optional. The ocean was large, unpredictable, and occasionally silent in the wrong moments. The Radio Act required ships to maintain continuous wireless communication, meaning someone always had to be listening day and night through storms and stillness alike. It also required operators to be licensed and equipment to meet certain standards so messages would not be lost in static or delayed until morning. The rule seemed simple enough, yet its effect was profound. A single adjustment that ensured cries for help would no longer float unanswered across the dark water. A second major development arrived in 1914 with the establishment of the International Ice Patrol. Born from collaboration between nations, it became a kind of gentle guardian, watching the northern waters where icebergs drifted unpredictably. Teams monitored frozen landscapes, charted shifting ice fields, and warned ships when the sea ahead carried hidden shapes carved from centuries-old glaciers. The Ice Patrol did not dramatically alter shipping routes or rewrite navigation as a whole. Instead, it acted like a quiet companion, offering steady updates that allowed captains to make informed decisions. Ships began receiving reports about ice before they encountered it. Warnings traveled efficiently, and the wide Atlantic gradually became a little less mysterious in its cold northern reaches. Even today, the Ice Patrol continues its work, a soft-spoken sentinel that still traces the pathways of ancient ice. Before these measures took full effect, however, the world gathered to discuss maritime safety in a broader sense. In 1913, representatives met for the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, a name that would eventually become one of the most recognized in global maritime regulations. The first version of SOLAS laid out guidelines with a seriousness softened by diplomacy. It addressed communication, lighting, equipment, ship construction, and emergency procedures, presenting each topic with a careful clarity shaped by the lessons of the Titanic. Although the outbreak of global conflict in 1914 delayed full implementation, the work did not disappear. The ideas were preserved, refined, and eventually put into official practice in 1929. SOLAS became a document that grew with time, adjusting gently as new technologies appeared and old assumptions dissolved. Its spirit remained consistent: to create a sea where safety was not a hopeful possibility, but a structured expectation. While regulations evolved, ship design itself began to shift in ways that addressed the vulnerabilities revealed by the Titanic. The most immediate and visible change involved lifeboats. Gone were the days when lifeboat capacity could be based on tonnage or aesthetic preferences. Ships now needed enough lifeboats for every passenger and every crew member, without exception. The result was a new look for large passenger ships. Boats lined the decks more densely, appearing in greater numbers and arranged with clearer access pathways. Drills became more frequent, equipment more standardized, and loading procedures more widely taught. Lifeboats transitioned from optional equipment to essential architecture, woven into the identity of every vessel. Another adjustment came in the form of revised bulkhead and compartment designs. Naval architects had learned that watertight sections needed to extend higher, seal more completely, and be spaced in ways that slowed the spread of water more effectively. Designers embraced new ideas about structural division, raising the heights of bulkheads and reconsidering how compartments connected vertically and horizontally. These changes did not make ships unsinkable, but they made them far more resilient against flooding, allowing more time for evacuation and potential rescue. Communication systems also underwent refinement. Ships adopted standardized distress signals and lighting protocols, reducing the risk of misinterpretation. Equipment improved gradually as manufacturers upgraded models for clarity and durability. Communication drills became part of standard operations, ensuring that wireless officers and deck officers worked together with greater unity. A more subtle change influenced the daily attitudes of maritime crews. Where earlier generations had carried a largely unshakable faith in engineering, later crews adopted a calmer form of confidence, one supported not only by belief in their vessels but by preparation. Safety meetings became more routine. Inspections grew more thorough. Training developed rhythms that mirrored the sea itself, steady and repetitive, each practice shaping familiarity. International cooperation also expanded. Nations that had once operated with independent maritime regulations began recognizing the value of shared standards. After all, the ocean did not ask for passports, and icebergs did not respect borders. This understanding encouraged countries to synchronize their policies, creating a more unified system of communication and safety expectations. The transformation did not occur with fanfare. There were no dramatic unveilings or fireworks marking the introduction of new rules. Instead, the changes entered the world like gentle reforms in a quiet town, Noticed gradually rather than suddenly, ships left port with slightly different arrangements. Officers carried updated manuals. Wireless stations buzzed a little more frequently. Maritime academies added new chapters to their training books. Passengers, too, became part of this evolving culture. Rather than stepping aboard with unquestioned trust in a ship's indestructibility, travelers found reassurance in the visibility of safety measures. Lifeboats were no longer hidden from view for aesthetic reasons. Crew members performed drills in sight of passengers. Safety pamphlets appeared in cabins. All of this created a new kind of confidence, not built on the idea that nothing bad could happen, but on the idea that people were ready if it did. Over time, these changes became so integrated into maritime operations that they began to feel natural, as though they had always been there. Few passengers today step aboard a ship and wonder why someone is monitoring radio frequencies around the clock. Few think about the height of bulkheads or the number of lifeboats or the patrols watching ice fields in the North Atlantic. These things simply exist, steadied into place by decades of lessons carried forward from earlier tragedies. The Titanic, as large and striking as it was, became part of this quiet evolution. Its legacy entered the design of ships built long after its loss, the training of officers who had never heard first-hand accounts, and the global agreements that stitched maritime nations into a network of shared safety. The regulations carried its imprint, the protocols held its echoes, and the architecture reflected its lessons. Through meetings, committees, revisions, and continuous communication, the maritime world learned to listen more closely, to prepare more thoroughly, and to treat the sea with a measured respect rooted not in fear but in attentiveness. Safety became something intentional, something designed, something that grew piece by piece through thoughtful adaptation. And while the changes were practical in nature, their effect rippled outward into a sense of calm that modern travelers rarely question. When a ship leaves port today, gliding past buoys and breakwaters under the soft hum of engines, it carries with it a century of carefully constructed safety, a quiet inheritance shaped by moments when the world realized it needed to do better. The sea remains vast and unpredictable, but it is now met with a readiness crafted through international cooperation, improved engineering, and the steady work of people who decided the ocean should be crossed with greater care. In this way, the reforms that followed the Titanic continue to move through time, not loudly, not fiercely, but steadily, like a gentle swell that rises and falls across the surface of a calm and watchful ocean. Long after the inquiries ended, and long after regulations began reshaping the maritime world, the influence of the Titanic continued flowing quietly through certain communities, particularly in Southampton. The city had been the point of departure for the ship, and many of the crew had called it home. When the Titanic sank, Southampton became a place where absence settled into daily life, not with noise, but with a gentle rearranging of routines, faces, and expectations. The long-term impact, there was not a dramatic wave, but a steady tide, the kind that changes a shoreline one grain of sand at a time. In Southampton, entire streets had at least one household connected to a crew member who never returned. The port, once associated with departures and cheerful clusters of sailors, gradually acquired a tone of quiet recognition. Families adjusted to new roles, new financial realities, and new rhythms. Local businesses, especially those tied to maritime labor, adapted in subtle ways as workers shifted to other ships and other destinations. The city did not freeze in place, but it moved differently, shaped by the memory of what had happened far out on the Atlantic. Over time, commemorations appeared, not loudly, but in the soft manner of plaques, quiet gatherings, and slowly built traditions. These commemorations served as gentle reminders woven into the identity of the city. Children grew up hearing names spoken in calm conversations, sometimes realizing with a kind of thoughtful curiosity that their own families were connected to an event the world kept retelling. The city learned to balance its forward motion with a quiet nod to the past, allowing memory and everyday life to coexist comfortably. Other communities beyond Southampton experienced similar shifts, especially towns with seafarers employed on the Titanic. The long-term influence was rarely dramatic. Instead, it lingered in casual references in local museums that displayed fragments of maritime history, and in the patient storytelling habits of families who understood the event not as a spectacle but as something that touched their own dinner tables. Communities built small arcs of remembrance into their routines, like lighthouses glowing gently over familiar harbors. As years passed, the Titanic's story moved beyond immediate communities and entered a broader cultural space where historians, writers, and researchers began shaping it into a narrative that the wider world could understand. Among these voices, one name eventually stood out with calm clarity: Walter Lord. In 1955, Lord published A Night to Remember, a work shaped by meticulous research, interviews, and careful organization. The book did not rely on dramatization or embellishment. Instead, it offered a clear, steady portrayal of the night the Titanic sank, composed with a tone that felt almost like a long, detailed recollection told beside a quiet fire. Lord's writing treated every perspective with balance, moving from passenger to crew to officer with the gentle rhythm of someone turning pages at a relaxed pace. Working on the book, Lord contacted survivors from different countries, gathering details that might otherwise have slipped into obscurity. Each account, no matter how brief, formed part of the larger mosaic. His attentive method gave voice to individuals who had rarely shared their stories publicly, presenting their experiences in a calm, factual narrative. Instead of focusing on spectacle, Lord shaped an atmosphere of thoughtful observation. The book resonated widely because it captured something essential, not through emotional intensity, but through clarity. It read smoothly, almost soothingly, even though its subject was severe. People found themselves drawn in by the careful pacing, the grounded descriptions, and the respectful attention to detail. In many ways, it became the foundational text for modern understanding of the Titanic, offering readers a version of the event that felt neither sensationalized nor distant. The success of A Night to Remember helped renew interest in the Titanic across generations. Soon, filmmakers adapted the book into a motion picture, which further shaped public perception. The film used its own tools, quiet framing, slow shots of the ship, and steady pacing to recreate the night with a tone that matched Lord's writing. Viewers watched scenes unfold with a mixture of curiosity and calm, guided by a narrative style that avoided sharp dramatics in favor of steady unfolding. As decades passed, interest in the Titanic continued to grow, expanding into documentaries, novels, archival studies, and museum exhibitions. Each medium contributed its own form of remembrance. Films offered visual immersion. Books presented nuanced understanding. Exhibitions provided tangible connection through artifacts, replicas, and models that visitors could stand beside, imagining scale and structure. These exhibitions appeared in various cities and often adopted a gentle, museum-like atmosphere, Rooms were dimly lit to protect materials, but also to create a sense of stillness. Visitors moved slowly, reading captions written with careful neutrality. Glass cases displayed personal items recovered from the ship, ranging from watches to letters to folded garments. Each object sat quietly behind its protective panels, serving as both evidence and memory. Some exhibitions constructed partial recreations of cabins or hallways, allowing visitors to experience the proportions of the ship. Others cast star-like patterns on ceilings or played soft oceanic sounds to create a sense of place without overwhelming the senses. The tone of these displays remained calm, almost meditative. People walked through them in the same relaxed way they might explore an art gallery, noticing details, pausing occasionally, absorbing information without the pressure of hurried storytelling. In addition to formal exhibitions, the Titanic found a place in everyday culture. Documentaries aired regularly, each offering a slightly different perspective, often narrated in a voice that carried the slow, soothing cadence of late-night programming. Scholars continued refining research, accessing archives, comparing witness accounts, and revisiting technical evaluations. The ship became a subject not only of tragedy, but of historical curiosity, architectural study, and maritime evolution. Communities that had once held personal connections to the event adapted to this broader interest. Southampton, for example, incorporated the Titanic more deliberately into its cultural identity. Memorials were restored or expanded. Guided tours appeared, offering visitors a gentle walk through streets once home to crew members. Local storytellers and historians shared knowledge in a calm, conversational style that echoed the sleep version rhythms you enjoy, steady, unhurried, softly revealing one detail after another. Even beyond England, other places built their own points of remembrance. Museums in the United States, Canada, and Europe curated Titanic collections, each one shaped by the surrounding region's perspective. Some focused on engineering, others emphasized human stories, some highlighted the technological advancements that emerged afterward. All aimed to create an experience where the Titanic felt accessible not as a myth, but as a carefully preserved memory. By the late 20th century and into the 21st, the ship's story had expanded into new creative territories. Films brought cinematic interpretations, novels blended fact with imaginative reconstruction, and educational programs used digital models to demonstrate how the ship functioned. The Titanic also found a natural home in maritime academies, where students studied its structure as part of their training in engineering and navigation. In this growing sphere of cultural memory, the Titanic became something more than a historical event. It became a narrative environment that people entered through different mediums, each offering its own gentle pace. Readers moved through chapters at leisure. Museum visitors walked slowly among exhibits. Film watchers settled into soft, dim theaters. The story adapted itself to various forms without losing its underlying tone of quiet reflection. All the while, communities like Southampton continued to integrate this story into their identities, not with grand gestures but with measured acknowledgement. The city's memorials, the names on plaques, the local archives filled with crew documents, each element contributed to a long-term remembrance shaped as much by calm continuity as by historical significance. Today, the Titanic lives in public consciousness through an array of quiet channels. Research by individuals like Walter Lord keeps its details accessible. Exhibitions give it shape. Films and books give it narrative. Communities give it place. And all of these together sustain a memory that never fully fades, yet never overwhelms, moving with the same gentle persistence as waves along a familiar coast. In this way, the story of the Titanic remains present not through noise but through the steady work of those who document, preserve, and retell it. The ship continues to return to shore, not as a tragedy alone, but as a softly unfolding history, carried forward by everyone who keeps listening, where the deep finally spoke in quiet pieces. For decades after the Titanic slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the world carried its memory in documents, testimonies, photographs, and the calm retellings of those who had survived. People imagined the ship resting somewhere in the cold dark, far below the reach of sunlight or storm. The ocean kept its silence, holding the wreck in a realm where pressure outweighed curiosity and where technology had not yet found a way to see through 2.5 miles of water. Then came 1985, a year that would quietly shift the story from speculation to sight. That year, an American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard began exploring a stretch of the North Atlantic where coordinates and survivor accounts suggested the ship might rest. Ballard and his team carried with them new tools, small submersible cameras capable of descending into depths that once felt unreachable, and a mapping system able to trace the ocean floor with gentle electronic pulses. Their search did not move quickly. It drifted along the seafloor with the same patience that deep water demands, sweeping across ridges, silted plains, and long stretches of unbroken darkness. The team watched monitors glowing softly in their control room, scanning shapes that appeared and vanished like slow-moving shadows. The work required a kind of quiet concentration, a willingness to stare at screens where nearly nothing happened for long periods, punctuated occasionally by small, intriguing fragments of debris. Then one night, or more accurately, one early morning in shipboard time, the monitors revealed a shape that no one mistook for natural. A massive boiler appeared, resting on the ocean floor like a sleeping relic. Not far from it, pieces of steel plating lay scattered in a wide field, as if gently placed by a giant hand instead of torn away in catastrophe. It was not the ship's hull itself, but it was unmistakably part of the Titanic. The quiet exhale that followed inside the control room carried years of anticipation, dissolving into a mixture of astonishment and soft-spoken technical discussion. As the cameras moved forward, the expedition soon found the bow section, enormous and dignified even in ruin. Resting upright in the silt, it appeared almost serene, as though the ocean had wrapped it in a blanket of quiet and kept it suspended in time. The railings, though bent, were still discernible. The anchors still clung to the hull. The bow's shape was unmistakable, even softened by decades of deep-sea pressure. Further exploration revealed the stern section as well, lying far from the bow and scattered in broken, twisted forms. This distance confirmed something long debated, that the Titanic had indeed broken in two as it sank. Witnesses had disagreed about this detail in 1912, with officers like Lightoller insisting the ship had remained intact. But the deep sea offered its own testimony, gently and without argument. The two great halves rested separately, connected only by the field of debris that trailed between them, like a long-forgotten path. The discovery stirred fascination across the world. Newspapers carried images of the bow illuminated by submersible lights, and documentaries soon narrated the finding with calm, reverent tones. The Titanic once only a memory, now existed in clear visual form. Not a drawing, not a survivor's recollection, but the real structure itself, preserved in cold darkness. Yet with its rediscovery came a new set of questions that drifted into public conversation with their own soft persistence. Should anything be brought up from the wreck? Should objects resting on the seafloor remain there in peace? Or should they be retrieved for study, preservation, or display? Some argued that artifacts could teach future generations about maritime history. Others believed that the wreck site had become a kind of grave, deserving of quiet respect rather than excavation. As debates emerged, they carried none of the heated tone one might expect. Instead, most discussions took on a thoughtful quality, as though people were weighing the wishes of unseen voices. The ocean had preserved the site for more than 70 years, shielding it from waves, wind, and time. Now, with cameras moving through its corridors, humanity had to decide how to interact with a place that felt both historical and deeply personal. Over the following years, various expeditions returned to the site. Some visited solely to document and map the wreck. Others aimed to retrieve artifacts, which later appeared in exhibitions that drew visitors slowly past glass cases, illuminated like soft lanterns. These displays offered glimpses of personal items, pieces of the ship, and tools from daily life on board. People walked through galleries in quiet reflection, leaning closer to read labels written in calm, factual language. At the same time, concerns grew about deterioration. Bacteria, pressure, and natural erosion slowly changed the wreck's appearance. Railings weakened, deck structures softened. Some parts collapsed gently into themselves, absorbed by the ocean floor. Researchers knew the site would not remain unchanged. It was a living environment, shifting at its own pace according to rules older than the ship itself. As interest in the wreck increased, the era of survivors was coming to its natural end. Those who had once told their stories in interviews and documentaries grew older, their voices becoming softer and rarer. Each year, the number of living eyewitnesses diminished, and with them faded the final traces of direct human memory. Their accounts remained in recordings and written transcripts, preserved in archives and libraries, but the living presence behind those memories gradually faded, moving gently into history. By the time the last survivors reached the later years of the 20th century, public understanding of the Titanic existed largely through research, imagery, and cultural representation. The ship's story no longer depended on personal recollection, but on documentation, scholarship, and the deep-sea exploration that had revealed its resting place. The transition from lived memory to historical memory happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. One generation passed its knowledge to the next, through books, films, exhibitions, and occasional interviews. The next generation absorbed this knowledge not as news but as heritage. The Titanic became something understood through curated information rather than first-hand experience. In this way, the discovery of the wreck coincided gently with the end of an era. The deep sea revealed the ship. At nearly the same moment, the voices of those who remembered the night were fading into silence. It created a kind of poetic balance, not dramatic, not emphasized, but noticeable if one listened closely. As human witnesses departed, the ocean itself provided a final testimony, allowing people to see what memory alone could not preserve. Today, the wreck remains in its cold resting place, visited occasionally by research teams and submersibles that glide through the darkness like quiet guests. The bow still stands, dignified in its solitude, The stern still rests in its fractured sprawl, telling the story of what force and water can do to steel, and the debris field still stretches between them, a gentle trail of objects that once belonged to a ship bustling with life. The Titanic now exists as a convergence of memory, science, history, and quiet reverence. It is no longer a recent event or a living recollection. It is a place, a symbol, and a story carried forward by images captured in deep water. The ocean holds it with the same steady patience it has shown for millennia, preserving and slowly transforming it at a pace that belongs entirely to the deep. In the end, the discovery of the wreck did more than locate a lost ship. It allowed the world to close a circle with calm understanding. It confirmed details long discussed. It offered a final glimpse into a moment suspended far below the surface. And it marked the transition from an era where the Titanic lived in human voices to an era where it lived in quiet photographs, measured research, and the gentle curiosity of those who continue to look toward the sea and wonder what else still rests beneath the waves. When the ocean became the last storyteller. As years continued drifting forward in their unhurried procession, the wreck of the Titanic settled deeper into the long rhythm of the sea. What had once been a sharply outlined ship, defined by steel and rivets and firm architecture, began softening under the quiet persistence of the deep. The ocean does not rush. It simply continues. And in that continuation, the wreck slowly transformed, not in sudden collapses, but in gentle shifts, as if time itself were exhaling steadily across every surface. Rust blooms known as rusticles grew downward like delicate underwater stalactites. Railings bent further, deck plates folded softly inward. The bow held its shape for many decades, still solemn and recognizable, but even this iconic form began showing the subtle sag that comes from continuous pressure and drifting currents. The stern, already fragmented when it reached the ocean floor, dispersed further into scattered geometry. Each passing year carried these transformations forward with a calm inevitability, leaving the wreck simultaneously familiar and ever-changing. Scientists who visited the site described it with the measured tone of observers witnessing a slow natural process. Microorganisms, they explained, worked quietly through the metal, consuming and reshaping it. Water temperatures, currents, and chemical balances all contributed to the ship's gradual decline. Nothing dramatic, nothing abrupt, just steady alteration. Like an old book, losing its binding while the pages remain readable for a while longer, the Titanic continued offering stories, even as its physical form grew softer beneath the deep. While the ship yielded itself to time, the era of living witnesses also moved toward its natural conclusion. Over the decades, survivors entered old age, each carrying their memories with the gentle discretion that many adopted after a lifetime of recounting or choosing not to recount their experiences. Interviews grew fewer. Public appearances dwindled. The voices that had once spoken of cold water, slanting decks, and lifeboats in the dark gradually became rarer, as though the story itself were preparing to rest. The final shift came quietly in 2009 when Milvina Dean, the youngest passenger aboard the Titanic, passed away. She had been an infant at the time of the sinking, too young to remember anything, yet her presence served as a symbolic link to the ship's living past. With her departure, the Titanic entered a new phase of existence. No living person could speak from direct experience anymore. Its memory no longer traveled through conversations or personal anecdotes. Instead, it became something held entirely in records, research, photographs, film, and the calm narratives shaped by historians. This transition did not feel abrupt. It arrived with the same gentle pacing that had carried the story for nearly a century. The Titanic shifted from lived memory into historical memory, from something recounted by those who had been there into something curated, studied, and preserved by those who came afterward. It joined the long line of events remembered primarily through the work of archivists, scholars, and storytellers, each adding clarity where time had blurred details and collecting fragments before they dissolved completely. Museums continued their careful preservation of artifacts, arranging them behind glass with the soft glow of climate-controlled lighting. Researchers compared documents, cross-referenced testimonies, and built comprehensive timelines. Documentaries narrated the ship's story in calm, reflective voices. Writers shaped its history into books that flowed with gentle pacing, allowing readers to drift through each chapter. Students encountered it in lessons not as recent tragedy, but as an illustrative moment in maritime history. And meanwhile, the wreck itself remained on the ocean floor, transforming quietly into something more like a natural formation than a constructed vessel. The two realms, the deep sea and the archives on land, became the dual keepers of the Titanic's legacy. One held the physical remains, dissolving slowly in cold darkness. The other held the intellectual remains, preserved in paper, film, digital scans, and exhibitions that traveled from city to city with slow, museum-like grace. What had once been a personal event for those aboard became a cultural event for everyone else. Generations who never saw the Titanic, never heard a survivor speak, and never lived in the world of early 20th century travel now encountered it as a symbol, a story, a lesson, or simply a fascinating moment in history. The ship belonged not to memory but to reflection, passed gently along through classrooms, documentaries, and the soft hum of historical curiosity. In this final stage, the Titanic occupies a unique space. It is not forgotten, yet it is no longer urgent. It exists in the same way quiet constellations exist, recognizable, studied, contemplated, and held at a distance that invites thought rather than emotion. The story continues to be retold, each version drifting through familiar points: the voyage, the iceberg, the lifeboats, the inquiries, the discovery of the wreck, the slow fade of survivors, and each telling becomes part of a larger mosaic, one that no longer depends on living memory but on the gentle continuity of shared historical imagination. The ocean, in its subtle way, becomes the final storyteller. It shapes the ship, erodes the details, reveals fragments, and conceals others. It suggests that stories survive not by remaining unchanged, but by being carried forward, interpreted, and reimagined by those who listen. The wreck may continue to soften, the metal may continue to fade, but the narrative persists, suspended not in steel but in understanding. And so the Titanic remains, both on the seafloor and in the world above, anchored in the quiet equilibrium between what has vanished and what endures. Its physical form sinks gradually into the deep. Its historical form rises gently through time, no longer a memory held by individuals, but a shared inheritance held by all who study it. In the end, the ship that once crossed the Atlantic with such confidence now drifts peacefully through history, carried not by engines or currents, but by the calm, ongoing curiosity of people who continue to read, watch, learn, and remember. It moves softly from generation to generation, not as a tragedy alone, but as a story that the ocean whispered back to the world in its own unhurried voice.